All right. So, hi, folks watching, and welcome to Heather Schafter. Heather is the author of Life with Libby, about Libby Frank, a mostly 20th century peace and justice activist. Um, so let's dig in, Heather. Tell us about your book, what it is, why you wrote it.
Sure. So I actually started writing this book in 2013. So Libby and I wrote the book together for about 10 years. I met Libby in 2003, and I worked with her in the Philadelphia chapter of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom.
Hmm.
And so I was working with her for about 10 years. I actually worked with her on the Middle East Committee. And in 2013, I thought about it and I'm like, Libby shared so many interesting and inspiring stories with me in the time that I knew her. And I don't think she ever told me the same one twice.
Wow.
So I was like, I think I need to write a book about her, So I asked her, we were at the Trolley Car Diner having lunch. I still remember it. And I said, Libby, has anyone ever talked to you about like writing a book about you? And she said, yes, but nobody's ever followed through.
Hmm.
Said, well, I would like to follow through. And she said, let's do it. So we wrote this book together, and it starts, her activism actually starts in the 1940s.
Hmm.
And it continues all the way. I mean, she continued being active almost up to her passing in December of 2023 at the age of 95 years old. So she had a very long career in peace and justice work.
Wow. Wow. So yeah, so just tell us some highlights of Libby's work and why we want to know about her.
Yeah. So, I mean, the reason that I wanted to know more about her, I mean, I already knew a lot about her, but I wanted to understand how she came to do all of the things that she did. And those were the questions that I wanted answered, and those are questions that are answered in the book.
So first, just tell us, what did she do?
Yeah, so she actually started out, one of her first demonstrations was at the British consulate to allow European Jewish refugees to enter Palestine because they
Hmm.
were fleeing Europe after World War II ended. And her work also was around the progressive movement. So she was part of the Young Progressive Party. She was working on issues like integration and racial equality. So she was going to integrated dances at a time when that was very unusual. She was desegregating public swimming pools by being part of a group of white and Black people who would go to whites only public swimming pools and have a picnic there until they would get kicked out.
And where did she live? Did she live in the South? Did she live in Philadelphia? Philadelphia wasn't segregated, was it, or was it?
So this was in I think the early 1950s in Ohio.
Oh,
Yeah. So I can't say whether Philadelphia was segregated then, but I wouldn't
oh,
be
I
surprised.
was. That's very
Yeah.
interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
And was she a teenager when she became active, or a young
Yeah,
woman?
I would say so. She was born in 1927, and that one protest I think was in 46, 47. She really got activated in college. She started, when the men started coming home from the
Hmm.
war and going to college on the GI Bill, she was there and she was talking to all of these men who had been to war. And she was really getting exposed to global politics at this time.
Mm-hmm.
But I think she was, there were a lot of other women in the college with her, and she said not many women were particularly interested in these topics. And one of the driving forces for her, I think, was actually her Jewish upbringing. And she took away from her Jewish upbringing these ideals of particularly justice.
So, so I'm hearing at first she was, it sounds like at first she was advocating for what ended up becoming Israel.
Yes.
Um, she was fighting against segregation.
Mhm.
So what are some of the other issues that she's been involved in?
She also worked on issues for the rights of farm and factory workers.
Mm,
So
mhm.
she was supporting workers' strikes. And she later, and she worked on ending the Vietnam War. So she became, her first paid peace job was with the Bergen County Peace Center, and their mission was to end the Vietnam War.
In
And while
in New Jersey?
in New Jersey, yes. And while she was there, she actually hosted Jane Fonda
Aw.
to come and speak about ending the war at Vietnam. And they also had draft counselors to help the young men legally avoid being sent to Vietnam. So she was very active in that movement. And then while she was still there, she started getting involved in a different kind of Middle East issue, which was she was hearing about some injustice going on in Israel and in the Middle East related to Palestinians.
Mhm.
And she wanted to learn more about it. So she actually hosted a public discussion while she was still at the Bergen County Peace Center. And it was very cutting edge at the time. I mean, people just would not talk about this in public. They would whisper about it, but you just couldn't talk about this issue that like Israel could do anything bad ever.
Mhm. I think that was true 10 years ago, but
Yeah.
probably even more so then. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So she spent decades focused on Middle East peace and justice. And she wasn't just focused on Israel and Palestinians. There are a lot of countries in the region, and she actually led a delegation of 16 women to visit the Middle East. They visited 5 countries. They met with organizational leaders and political party leaders within each of the countries that they visited, and they had brought with them a statement on the Middle East of, their vision for peace and justice in the Middle East. And they shared this statement with everyone they met, and they got feedback, and they asked questions, and they learned a lot. And then they came back to the United States and they started educating people. They were speaking and writing and spreading these more nuanced ideas about what is happening on the ground in this part of the world. And I really think they laid the groundwork for organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace or Jews on Our Own Terms, or some of the organizations that exist today. I feel like in some sense they're on the shoulders of the people who were working at that time. And Libby wasn't the only one working on these issues at that time, right? She had mentioned, I'm probably going to mispronounce his name. Alan Soleimano was a big leader in the movement at that time. And I think even Art Waskow, Rabbi Art Waskow was involved in at the time. So she was working with a lot of people on this issue that were all on the cutting edge of how do we understand the complexities of this region?
Mm. And what did you discover about, the question for you is like, why did she do these things? Like now that we've got a picture of the actions she took and what she was involved in. Excuse my cat. She's always
Oh, is that what that
um,
is?
um what did you find out, the questions you asked her about like what brought her to doing these things?
I
Take
think,
interest.
I think that's a compound question. Um, So there's the question of why. I mean, I think a lot of us have within us this drive for justice.
Excuse me.
Bless you.
Yeah.
And Libby had that drive for justice. I mean, part of it was she grew up during the Depression. Her father had a hard time keeping a job. The family was struggling. They had to move around a lot for his job. I mean, she understood the challenges that people could face, when you don't have enough, right?
Mhm.
And then she also grew up in, with these values of justice and, not just from her religion, but also her family. Her grandfather had a grocery store, and during the Depression, people would come in and they would not be able to pay for their groceries, and he would give them IOUs. And sometimes they were able to pay them and sometimes they weren't. So she was raised with this sense of justice, I would say. But there's also what sustained her through decades of work. And one of the things, I think one of the biggest things, was the relationships that she had with other people. And what she really took away from this work is that you don't make a big impact all by yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You do work with other people, and your relationships with those people actually help you keep going. And she would sing with people. She sang all through her career. Folk music was a big inspiration for her and a lot of people of her generation. And so they'd get pulled in and they'd sing folk songs together. They'd be on the bus on their way to a desegregation action, and they'd be singing songs on the way there. So I think that the folk music, the relationships that they had, the passion that she had for justice was very strong. And she always kept a sense of humor, and that was really important to her too. So I think all of those things both motivated her and also kept her energized and kept her going throughout her life.
Yeah. So I'm curious, my dad is Jewish, and my aunt, if she were alive, would be Libby's age. And she said that, well, growing up in Jewish communities in New York City, at least, that socialism was everywhere, that it was in the air, that everyone breathed. Was that kind of the environment that she grew up in?
I would say she grew up in a mixed environment. Her parents were actually refugees from Eastern Europe.
Mhm.
So they were a bit gun shy about especially anything communist.
Interesting. Okay.
But so she went to this camp when she was, I think, a teenager, and a kind of centralist type Jewish organization had funded her attending the camp. But when she was there, that's when she met the labor Zionists, who were like the real like
Got it.
socialists.
Yep.
But she was part of a Jewish organization that was multifaceted, and she actually became president of that because she wasn't solidly in any particular camp. But there was definitely a lot of socialism and Zionism running through the Jewish community in her area at that time.
And what I'm always interested when I hear about 20th century activists, like, what have you learned that people can make use of today that maybe we've forgotten, or maybe we've given up hope on, or what are some lessons that we can learn from successes and maybe non-successes, but like.
Yeah, well, I think the example of the delegation to the Middle East is a great one, because it's this idea of you learn and then you teach. And I think education of people is an important element of making progress. Another example that I could share is she took on My Weekly Reader, which some people might be familiar with, some people might not. But it is an educational publication. It's been around forever. I think it might still be around. It was published by Xerox, and it would go into all of the schools, and they would have a different magazine for each grade level.
Okay.
And so she had two children, and they were getting the My Weekly Reader, and she saw that it was very white,
Mhm.
and it was not very transparent about what was going on in Vietnam. So this was, while the Vietnam War was still going on. And, the My Weekly Reader would talk about Vietnam, and it would show US soldiers giving toys to Vietnamese children. And that was how it presented the Vietnam War to these students. So Libby organized a group of women through, I believe it was through the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, who would read the magazine every time it came out, and they would notate what they saw, and she had very specific questions for them, and she compiled this report, and she made a connection with a well-known person whose name is escaping me right now. But this person was able to get them a meeting with Xerox. By herself, she would not have been able to get that meeting.
Sure.
So I think that's a learning right there, is, who is able to get where and how do you connect with those people? So she had an introduction to this guy who like had a connection at Xerox, and they had this meeting and they met with Xerox and they presented what they found, and Xerox agreed to make the changes. And for a while, you would see Black people in my weekly reader. And they actually did a piece on the Olympics. There were 2 Olympians who were African American that had won medals one year around that time. And they were, they were doing the Black Power salute. And they had a picture of them in the My Weekly Reader, which that never would have happened
Never would have
otherwise.
happened otherwise. That's
No.
interesting. It reminds me of when I was in the bi movement in the 90s, and we, well, a lot of meetings were public, but of the gay and lesbian rights movement, we would attend the meetings, we would join the groups, and we would say, your language is not inclusive. And I specifically remember when the fight for same-sex marriage started really heating up in Connecticut. Like 6 of us attended a meeting and it was a big meeting, right? And we all said, oh, I'm here from Combination, here to make sure that the bi movement the bi perspective gets included. And at the end of the meeting, the lobbyist just came up to us and was like, what are your demands? I mean, I don't think that's she said it, but she's like, what do you want? And we like
Wow.
had to come up with 4 with demands on the spot. We had 4 of them. And it was like this, and she was like, yes, maybe, no, yes, right? And but that wasn't happening all across the country. This was in
Yeah.
Connecticut. We were not that big a group, but we were focused and we were in
Yeah.
the right meeting with the decision maker, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah. And and it became a culture change that is now universal, right? Nobody says gay and lesbian movement anymore.
Right. Yeah. It's awesome. It's awesome to see the wins.
Yeah. Yeah. And also the pathway, right? Because that's kind of what I like.
Yeah.
I was in elementary school in the 70s, so I'm sure that what the curriculum I got was influenced by Libby's actions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And one meeting can change the direction. And when you think it can't, right? You think
Mm-hmm.
everything's locked down. Very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. It's having faith in a sense that something can change, because if you don't think that anything can change, it can stop you from doing anything. So, I mean, Libby had faith that if I do these things, that something different can happen. And so she did those things, and then something different happened.
That's, yeah. And yet I feel like there's another thing, because a lot of us have faith, right? And
Yeah.
something doesn't happen. So I'm wondering, like, is this, you mentioned like uh building organizations, not trying to do anything alone, making connections, keeping the joy going with music.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, my sense is that all those pieces come together. And it also sounds like there's also a subtext of like conversation as opposed to confrontation. I mean, confrontation that's coming from with an approach of conversation. I know when we spoke before, you said that she had a big meeting about the situation in Israel and the Middle East, where
Yeah.
people who really disagreed were able to have dialogue. And I don't know anybody who can do that right now.
Yeah, that was in England, in Birmingham, England, during a WILF conference. She ran a workshop, and there were women from around the world that were coming together in this workshop to talk about the Middle East. And this was actually the precursor to the trip
The
that
tour.
she took, right? So the previous attempts at talking about the Middle East had ended with the women becoming very angry at each other, to the point where some of them were throwing purses at each other.
Wow. Same group.
What's that?
The same group, same organization had tried to have that
Um,
conversation. Yeah.
yeah, it was Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and it did not go well the previous couple of times that they tried this. So Libby knew that she had a big challenge, because there were people that had very different opinions and people from different countries. And so she worked with allies of some of the women that were going to be in the room. She had a co-facilitator, and they came up with some rules that helped them have a productive conversation. And she said one of the more controversial rules was starting from today,
Hmm.
which meant that, and it's especially difficult with the Middle East, because depending on what year you start your history, that's who
Right.
started it, right? And so basically the idea is, like, we're not here to talk about who started it. That's not going to help us find a vision for the future. So we're starting from today. We're not looking at who did what to who in the past. We're going to look at what do we need to do moving forward. That was one rule. And another rule was you can only criticize your own government.
Mm. Mm. Interesting.
Those rules, along with some more standard rules, like we don't talk over each other, and how we're going to communicate. But because of that, they were able, as a group, to come up with agreed upon next steps for the WILF organization, which enabled them to move forward and enabled them to put together their statement on the Middle East, and create reports that represented that organization.
That's amazing. So they found common ground.
They found common ground. Yeah.
Yeah. My previous business was a facilitation business, and there was we did a lot of like consensus building within organizations across disagreement. I don't know if it was ever as hot as, as this issue, but that's really beautiful. And yeah, focus on the future is one of the principles of what we were doing. Um, wow, that's really great. So I think the last question is, how do we find the book? Where do we get the book?
Okay, well, right now the book is on Amazon.
Oh, show us the book.
Um, this is it.
Oh, it's so cute. It's so
Yeah,
modern looking and it's
yeah,
funny at the
yeah.
same time.
So
It's very cool.
this is actually a picture of Libby,
Hmm.
cartoonized. So this picture's inside the book as well. You can see the actual black and white picture. And it's called Life of Libby: Chasing Peace and Justice with Humor, Guts, and Passion.
Mm.
And I also have a Facebook page where I've just shared some quotes, some ideas, some photos, just fun things to learn more about Libby and more about the book and the process. So that is on Facebook under Libby Frank Activist is the URL, but the page is called Life of Libby.
Okay, so just to recap, book is on Amazon.
Yes.
The more information to interact with is on Facebook.
Yes.
And the name of the book and the website, I mean, and the Facebook page is Life of Libby. And
Yes.
your name is Heather Shafter, Shafter.
You got it. That's all of it.
Oh, well, this is so wonderful. I'm so grateful that you're Well, I'm always grateful when people are documenting what happened in the 20th century because I think there were some really great movements that we're trying to, I think we try to imitate, but sometimes we really miss the point, right? We're trying to
Mm,
imitate, I don't know what to exactly, but the outcomes and not the process or something. Um,
mhm,
or what you can see on TV, but there's something about actually hearing the specific stories and the people involved and yeah, the people, the personalities, the tactics, the events that that's really uplifting and that um yeah, gives a much more realistic idea and brings out our creativity. So this has been a wonderful conversation and thanks for getting this voice out into the world.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. All right. And as I end all, I'm going to hit stop recording.